What a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street, singing the song and they carry inside. Mostly saying hooray for our side. There's battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. Young people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop children, what's that sound? Everybody looks, it's going down.
Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner. Welcome to The Robust Opposition. I'm really pleased to have my guest, Evan Greer, with me tonight. I have known her since about 2013, I believe it was, when I started organizing protests for net neutrality when Obama was president. And we were trying to get him to get his FCC chief, Tom Wheeler, to institute net neutrality. And we had a great victory. So Evan is the Deputy Director of Fight for the Future, which is a hard-hitting digital rights group. And she also writes regularly for The Guardian, NBC News, The Washington Post, and Newsweek. Thank you so much for being with me tonight, Evan, and I'm really sorry about the technical problems.
No worries. The internet doesn't always work the way we want it to.
Exactly. So why don't you tell us about Fight for the Future and specifically your great work initially in getting net neutrality? Because I was always very impressed with the creative tactics that you and your group employed.
Sure. So Fight for the Future is a digital rights organization, as you said, which is basically a fancy way of saying that we're trying to stop governments and corporations from screwing up the internet that we all know and love, and that's given so many of us a voice, more of us than really have ever had one in our democracy in the past. And we were founded a number of years ago in the lead up to the fight over SOPA-PIPA, so copyright legislation that could have led to widespread internet censorship. That was before I joined the organization, but they came together with activists and creators from across the internet to organize the SOPA blackout, which was the largest online protest in history. And since then, we've continued trying to harness the power of the internet to channel kind of online outrage and anger, which we see so often, into real political power. And so that's what we did, when we kind of, you and I first crossed paths, Lauren, in, as you said, the fight to get strong net neutrality protections under the Obama administration. We used many of those same tactics of organizing the traffic from major websites and YouTube creators, and kind of all of the nooks and crannies of the internet where people are creating things or expressing themselves or sharing their ideas with the world, bringing all of that energy together to put real political pressure on our members of Congress, and in that case on the FCC and the Obama administration. And it's always sort of, I wince every time I see mainstream media now referring to the net neutrality rules that were just repealed as Obama-era net neutrality protections, because the fact is that we had to drag the Obama administration kicking and screaming into actually instituting those. So that was really a grassroots victory, and a victory for the internet in defending itself. So that's some of the history of our organization, Fight for the Future. And we also work on a wide range of other issues that impact our basic rights in the digital age, from surveillance and privacy to free speech and free expression.
Well, that's great. And we love the work that you do. And Free Press also, Craig Aaron from Free Press has been on my show to talk about net neutrality. So we did achieve net neutrality. We got Obama to get Tom Wheeler. And when Tom Wheeler was talking about it, he sounded like us. We basically had him come around to our way of thinking. And then, of course, Trump gets into power, appoints Ajit Pai, another, Telcom lobbyist, and he tries to repeal it. And so why don't you talk about what's gone on in the last 2 years with net neutrality? Just bring us up to date and where we stand now.
Sure. So, as you said, our victory in some ways was short-lived. Although net neutrality is far from dead, and the fight to restore it is really just gearing up. But yes, Ajit Pai was a former top lawyer at Verizon, is now the chairman of the FCC. I'm sure people are familiar with him and his work undermining our basic rights on the internet. He moved to repeal those net neutrality protections that we fought for. And it's probably worth just taking a moment to remind folks what net neutrality is all about. This is essentially the First Amendment of the internet, the basic protections that prevent our companies like Comcast, Verizon, and AT&T, the companies that connect us to the internet, from controlling what we see and do once we get there, whether that's with outright censorship or blocking content, slowing down or speeding up apps or websites based on who pays the money, or other forms of extra fees and manipulation through cost and putting things essentially behind paywalls by charging companies or charging users to access content that they're used to getting in their monthly internet bill. So quick refresher on net neutrality for folks. But moving along, as I said, the FCC repealed those rules. I'm sure everyone remembers that. It was a huge moment. The internet exploded with outrage from across the political spectrum. Polls consistently show that basically everyone supports net neutrality. Republicans, Democrats, independents, conservatives, libertarians, Trump supporters, pretty much any group of people that you poll is going to agree, no, I don't want my cable company controlling what websites I can visit or what apps I use to get weather or listen to music or watch videos or get news or connect with the world. That's something that pretty much everyone can agree on. So that outrage from across the political spectrum has had a real impact. We managed to get legislation via the Congressional Review Act passed through the Senate with bipartisan support that essentially rebuked the Trump administration's repeal of net neutrality. And then we'd managed to get more than 180 members of the House of Representatives, a historic number of members of the House, even in the difficult climate that we were fighting in over the last year, to sign on to a discharge petition in an attempt to force a vote on the CRA there. In the end, House leadership blocked that, but we're now heading into 2019 with a tremendous amount of momentum and pressure on Congress to do something about this and to push the FCC to either restore these protections, to investigate the myriad aspects of fraud and abuse that occurred during the FCC repeal process, and potentially to pass good legislation that actually restores these key protections that keep the internet a level playing field and an open platform for expression and exchange of ideas. So there's a number of paths forward on that in 2019, but that's a little bit of the history of how we got here.
Okay, now you've said that this is bipartisan, which it is, and my concern is that the president doesn't really care about what the people want. He's put in people, in promising to drain the swamp. He's put in people that are the swamp. He literally has lobbyists and former employees from the agencies running the agencies they're supposed to be regulating. And I'm just kind of wondering how much public pressure is even going to work. We were talking about the shutdown earlier in my news segment before I had technical difficulties. And you could see that McConnell isn't even going to listen to the people. I mean, they've kind of hitched their wagon to Trump for some reason. And how do you think that we're going to be able to prevail in this as long as they have the presidency and the Senate?
Well, I think this is a good moment to revisit what we were just talking about with the fight during the Obama administration and Tom Wheeler. We weren't in that different of a situation then. We had an FCC chairman who was a former telecom lobbyist who had essentially already said he wasn't going to do what we wanted him to do. But in the end, I think you're right that he sided with us because we proved that it was politically possible to do the right thing. And I think that's really, we're building grassroots power. And really what we're going to have to do is actually remain on kind of the defense over the next 2 years. What Ajit Pai did could be relatively easily reversed either by the courts. We have an excellent chance of winning in court, or by a future FCC chair. So as long as we can prevent bad legislation from passing over the next 2 years, legislation that's framed as a compromise and pushed by telecom lobbyists, but would actually undermine our ability to enforce net neutrality for years to come. As long as we can stop that from happening, there's an excellent chance that we're going to get back those net neutrality protections that were repealed, again, either through the courts or through Congress. That said, there's also fights brewing in the states. I know you're out in California, Lauren, and SB 822, the legislation that we managed to get passed, again with bipartisan support in the California legislature, is one of the strongest net neutrality protection pieces of net neutrality policy that's ever been enacted in the world, not even just in the United States.
Right.
And while it faces litigation, which was expected during the entire course of the fight, it was a really historic victory that we were able to get this done in California. And that actually already provides a major deterrent to ISPs. They're incredibly unlikely to start rolling out some of the worst and most harmful things that they could do in a world with no net neutrality when there's a strong law already on the books in California. There's already been a strong rebuke of that type of activity in the Senate. There's a court case brewing. There's states attorney generals investigating. All of those things are essentially what's holding these companies in check right now. And that's why it really matters that we keep the grassroots pressure on. And while, I'm not going to tell you that we're going to convince Donald Trump to suddenly fire Ajit Pai and do the right thing. Having that grassroots pressure in place and continuing to move ourselves forward and build support in Congress on both sides of the aisle and keep the pressure on the FCC does make a real difference in allowing us to stave off those attacks over the next 2 years and then likely get the rules back shortly after that.
Now, isn't he under investigation for something that he did that was either illegal or unethical? And now that the Democrats have control of the House, couldn't they start some investigations into him?
So under Ajit Pai's leadership, the FCC ran one of the most egregiously flawed public comment processes in their entire history. So when the FCC does something, they're supposed to invite comments from the public because these issues affect enormous numbers of people. During the Obama era fight, as you mentioned, millions of people commented to the FCC, and that was one of the things that spurred them to actually do the right thing in that case. They were able to say, look, there's a huge amount of public support for these rules. We're going to do the right thing. Ajit Pai did the exact opposite. He wanted to ignore that overwhelming opposition to his repeal. And so he based his repeal almost entirely on studies that were funded by the telecom industry, and very essentially outright ignored all of that public input. But in the meantime, the comment docket was also flooded with fraudulent comments. The FCC was caught lying to reporters about an alleged DDoS attack that was likely actually just large numbers of net neutrality supporters commenting on the site after John Oliver's segment on the issue. There was just a wide range of issues, and the FCC has essentially stonewalled investigations. They've refused FOIA requests. Ajit Pai claims to be running the most transparent FCC in history, and that's just absolutely laughable. He's been, nothing but obstructionist in terms of investigations into that fraud and abuse. And so, yes, now that Democrats or more importantly, net neutrality supporters control the relevant committees that provide oversight for the FCC, Ajit Pai's life is going to change quite a bit. He is going to be dragged in front of committee hearings. They can subpoena information. They can ask him all kinds of questions that I'm sure he would rather not answer. And that is going to have an impact. There's a question of just how much of a liability are Republicans in Congress willing to let this guy become? Again, with an issue that polls incredibly strong with their own base. Republicans also look at Ajit Pai and see someone who's corrupt and used to work for telecom companies who charge them too much for crappy cell phone service. So this is not one of those issues that has already solidified into kind of a left-right thing. It's something that really just anyone can recognize and understand. And I think that's, in the end, going to be what gets us these rules back.
So now, before we switch to our next subject, which is Facebook, what can people do right now? What should they be doing right now if they care about net neutrality?
Sure. So we actually, on that subject we were just discussing, Fight for the Future is currently running a petition calling on Congress to investigate Ajit Pai. So to really show public support for them to do as much as they can with oversight of the FCC. So, you've got I see you have our website up on the screen, fightforthefuture.org. Find us on Twitter or social media. Go sign one of those petitions. That's really helpful right now, just to show that this is an issue that people are still thinking about and prioritizing. And, frankly, just because there's Democrats in control of the House doesn't mean that they're going to immediately act on this unless people are pressuring them. We're a nonpartisan organization, and we recognize that regardless of which party is in power, if we're not showing that this is something that we're willing to fight for, neither party is going to give it to us. The telecom industry has given enormous amounts of money in campaign contributions to both Democrats and Republicans. They have tremendous influence in Washington, D.C. And so this is something that people need to be keeping the pressure on about and speaking out about, even right now, while we're sort of in a bit of a build-up phase. And then it's likely that legislation will be introduced in the House or the Senate over the next couple months. And then it'll be really important for folks to engage, to call their members of Congress, to show up at the meetings and protests and events. But really connecting with some of the organizations that are fighting on this is the best thing you can do right now. So in addition to Fight for the Future, there's the Center for Media Justice, who are out there doing incredibly important work, fighting this issue and looking at the ways that communities of color are directly impacted by telecom-related issues. There's Free Press, as you mentioned. There's Demand Progress, Color of Change. So many groups are out there working on this. So, get connected with a group that's working on net neutrality and get ready for the next phase of the fight.
Now we're going to switch topics to talk about Facebook. The bane of my existence. I must do my show on Facebook because I have like twice as many followers on Facebook as I do have subscribers on YouTube. So as much as I would love to get my show off of here and go on to YouTube, where I have so much more functionality, I'm stuck here. And they're always putting me in Facebook jail. I try to share my show. As soon as if I go too quickly or I share in too many groups, boom, I'm in jail for a week, 2 weeks, and it's very frustrating. So I need you guys to share my show for me. I'm in Facebook jail again until Saturday. But anyway, what happens to me is inconsequential to what's happening to a lot of other people. I mean, we've seen that 800 pages have been scrubbed by Facebook because they are using the Atlantic Council, which is this neocon think tank, to vet what is fake news or not. So a lot of left-wing activists and organizations are losing their pages. And the latest thing that we read is that Facebook has shared our private messages with third parties. So why don't you tell us a little bit about Facebook and their dirty deeds and what you guys have been finding out and investigating?
Sure. So, I mean, there's so many different things to talk about here. And I think you hit the nail on the head with your first point, which is that here you are, an activist and someone who cares about issues of privacy and free speech, and you're running your show on Facebook because it is the platform where you're able to reach people. And that, I think, is the crux of this issue, is just the centralization of the internet. So going from a world where, sort of there was millions of websites and everyone sort of had their own website or blog, to now a world where there's a handful of companies that you could count on one hand that essentially control, the vast majority of sort of eyeballs or people's attention on the internet. And so Facebook is, certainly been in the spotlight quite a lot, although almost, many of the things that we could talk about related to them in terms of both their manipulation of content and moderation, which often, ends up being both censorship and then also failing to moderate things that they maybe probably should. And then also the privacy and data collection issues. So there's a bunch of different stuff to start there. Why don't we start with the privacy stuff, since you mentioned that? So there was a major story in the New York Times, I guess we're going on a couple weeks ago now, that was just sort of the latest revelation of ways that Facebook has been incredibly careless with the enormous amount of data that they've collected. And careless is maybe really the wrong word here, because this isn't just sort of like an oops, we spilled some data. Facebook has built their entire business model essentially in what you might call the surveillance economy. So, their business model is basically collecting as much data about each of us as they possibly can, finding different ways to package that, and then essentially allowing advertisers to use it to sell us stuff. That's not a new thing. TV does that. Most advertising-based businesses are doing some level of this. Facebook basically just got better at it than everyone else, which is how they grew so quickly. But being better at it essentially means that they're using more and more incredibly intimate details of our lives. You might argue that Facebook or other apps that are collecting data knows as much or more about us than we know about ourselves. And that's a fairly frightening thought, and there's a variety of ways that that can be used. One of the more egregious was the Cambridge Analytica story that really showed this isn't just about privacy, or some people say, well, this is all information I posted publicly on the internet. Like, why do I care about my privacy on Facebook? Well, this was an example of how it couldn't be used just to find out things about you, but actually to manipulate how you think, using your own data against you. So this New York Times story a few weeks ago was showing how Facebook essentially allowed third-party apps like Spotify and others to access much more data than anyone had previously thought they had access to. Again, that's just sort of a symptom of the broader problem of Facebook having this massive trove of data. Essentially, once a company collects that amount of data, it's never going to be safe. Even if the company does everything in its power to keep it safe, it's really, essentially impossible to protect that type of data, whether it's from hackers or from the US government, who could collect it either through legal or illegal means. Frankly, the way for companies to protect our privacy is to avoid collecting data that they don't need in the first place. So really, there's a number of ways we could talk about this problem. Congress is sort of beating the drum on this. But frankly, privacy protections are an important start, but really in the end, to solve this problem, we need a less centralized internet, and we need to push back on this business model of making money by collecting our data and essentially selling it or repackaging it or using it against us.
Now, you and I were talking offline about what we can do about this, and I used the term nationalizing in a broad sense of basically making it a public utility, not necessarily centralizing it where the national government would control it. And I don't know how that would work. I mean, we talked about municipal broadband, which is more about the transmission lines, but I mean, what do you see in terms of alternatives to Facebook that, I mean, could it be broken up? Could it be, I mean, I can't even think outside the box here, but I'm sure you've done some thinking.
Sure. I mean, again, this is a big problem, and there isn't one silver bullet solution to it. And I think that's really important, because everyone sort of wants there to be, or there's, sort of a sense of like, this is a problem and the tech companies should do something about it. And so one thing I just really want to caution folks is that there's nothing more dangerous for our basic rights in the digital age than when politicians from either party are screaming at tech companies and telling them to like just do something about a problem that's actually legit, potentially really difficult to solve. That's how we get bills like SOPA that could have led to widespread internet censorship. That's how we get legislation that expands government surveillance in the name of cybersecurity, things like that. So we want to be cautious about the solutions that we seek here. That said, antitrust law is definitely one possibility. So there has been talk about breaking up companies like Facebook into their separate parts. There's no reason that Instagram and Facebook need to be the same company, for example. That's one possibility. And then to get a little bit more utopian or future thinking, I really think this is also a problem that technology and people organizing could potentially solve. So you could imagine a nonprofit, open source, collectively managed version of Facebook or Twitter, run maybe in a similar manner to something like Wikipedia, that's run as a nonprofit by a foundation, where there's more transparent and democratic control of the platform. But in the end, I think, again, this is something where we need to also just reframe how we think about the internet. But in the meantime, there's definitely things that we can and should do to mitigate the harm that's coming from these incredibly large platforms that have already collected enormous amounts of our data and that aren't going away anytime soon. So it's absolutely also important that we push on Congress to enact basic common sense legislation that holds these companies accountable when they leak our data, or when they're collecting data that they shouldn't be collecting or not properly informing people about what their practices are. We should absolutely be pushing on the FTC to actually enforce those rules that they put into place, and not just sit on their hands and let these companies do whatever they want. But in the end, I think, again, this is a fundamental issue with this type of surveillance economy-based business model, and we're going to need alternatives to that. And I don't pretend to, be able to tell you exactly how to start building that. But if you ask me really, at a heart-based level, how you solve this problem, I think it's going to have to be something in that direction of more community-based models.
Yeah, well, there are these alternatives, minds, me, we, things that people are talking about. Friends of mine, activists, are building up platforms. JustInform.com is one that I've been asked to join. But the problem is everybody's still on Facebook. So if you want to have, it's like what you said in the beginning about my comment, if you want to have viewers, you have to be where the people are. But, the other problem with Facebook, and maybe we're going a little far afield of what we said we were going to talk about, but it's just that it's so atomized. People are just talking to who they already agree with. And I often feel that back in the day when I was growing up and there were just 3 television networks plus PBS, we were able to form some sort of national consensus because we were all seeing the same information. And now people are just seeing what they want to see, and it becomes very polarizing. It's hard to have discussions with people because they say what you're reading is fake news and you think what they're reading is fake news. Is there even a common agreement on what is a fact now? So it's very disconcerting. And then, of course, it's addictive because it's on a screen. They make it for that. You get a like or you get a share and you get all excited about that. And we have to, I don't know, I think we just have to, with any problem, the object is not censorship, obviously, but it's education. The more we educate people about what is going on and what is sort of happening to us, maybe we just have to get off it, just turn it off and do more things with people in real life. And, you see what I'm saying?
I wholeheartedly endorse going for a hike instead of Facebook.
All right, well, let's get to the next subject, which is the merger between Sprint and T-Mobile. Why don't you tell us where that stands and why that would be a disaster?
Sure. So, this is sort of an extension of the same problem that we were just talking about with centralization sort of on the internet. So, we already have enormous amounts of centralization, or rather lack of competition for the companies that connect us to the internet, and even less for wireless companies that allow people to connect to the internet from their phones. Right now, there's basically only 4 major mobile providers in the United States. And if T-Mobile and Sprint are allowed to merge, that'll bring it down to only 3. I don't, you don't have to go to a single economics class to understand why having, 4 companies down to 3 is going to screw over internet users and customers. And in this case, it's going to particularly harm low-income people and communities of color who are still affected most by the digital divide, who are most likely to be connecting to the internet exclusively or primarily on their phones. So this isn't just something that's going to end up costing people more money. It's actually going to cut people off of the internet. There's some number of people for whom having their data plan or cell phone plan go up will make the difference between whether or not they can be online at all. That means we're essentially silencing their voices, cutting people off from the internet, and losing some of the voices that we need to be hearing most of all at this incredibly important time in our nation's history when we're trying to find solutions for these incredibly difficult problems. So I think it's mergers are not the sexiest issue. They're not as much fun to talk about as government surveillance or whistleblowers or getting people out of jail or any number of other issues that sort of feel more visceral. But this is actually something that's going to affect an enormous number of people. And it's something that really isn't getting the attention that it deserves, I think, because it just sort of seems like, oh, it's just this wonky telecom, policy issue. Like, what does this have to do with me? Or I don't use Sprint or I don't use T-Mobile, so why should I care? And basically, if you care about hearing people's voices, if you care about people, the internet not being just for the wealthy and for the elite, then we should always oppose these types of mergers that lead to more centralization and less competition and less choice, and essentially less people being able to get online. So it's worth noting that this is something that's going to go before the FCC, and we've already talked quite a bit about the FCC. We know who's in charge of it. It seems pretty likely that they are primed to rubber stamp this deal. That said, there's already growing opposition. The Communications Workers of America, the union that represents many telecom employees, is opposing the merger. A number of other organizations, including Free Press and the Center for Media Justice, who I mentioned, are opposing it, as well as some companies like Dish and rural internet service providers and others who are saying that this decrease in competition will be bad for the entire market. So there is opposition here, and California has a particularly important role to play.
We have a California Public Utilities Commission that has to make a recommendation on this. And I remember meeting in Los Angeles several years ago to speak out against the Comcast-Time Warner merger. And Time Warner served, served Los Angeles. And then they were bought out by Spectrum, or they changed their name to Spectrum, and then ultimately they merged with Charter. So they didn't merge with Comcast, but they merged with Charter. And now the hearings are being held again next week. I'm not going to be able to go because I'm interviewing Varshini Prakash, the founder of the Sunrise Movement, at exactly the same time that the hearing starts. But why don't you tell us about the hearings in Los Angeles, in Fresno, and in San Diego?
Sure. So, as I said, the simplest way to explain this is this merger will make your cell phone bill more expensive. And so we have a website, which is thismergerwillmakeyourcellphonebill.moreexpensive.com. And if you go to that website, we have a map there that shows these events. The California Public Utilities Commission is, as you said, is reviewing the merger, and having them, oppose it would be a major step in the right direction. California is a big state. They've already, had a huge impact on net neutrality. So, this is a place where California could sort of lead and help folks across the rest of the country. So we really need to pack these hearings, because that T-Mobile and Sprint are going to be packing them with people. They're already doing their astroturfing. They're trying to get local groups and local politicians on board. These companies give out a tremendous amount of money. They have a lot of influence. And so they're going to pack the hearing with their people. And if we don't have real folks that are out at that hearing explaining why this merger is going to be bad for ordinary people, this is going to go through.
Yeah.
So
I remember when I went to testify last time, and I was shocked at how many minority groups had organizations there speaking, whether it was the local chapter of the NAACP or the Latino Boys and Girls Club. And I was kind of shocked at why these organizations were defending these big, horrible companies. It was the same thing when we were trying to get Los Angeles to divest from Wells Fargo, which we were successful in doing. They haven't fully done it yet, but they've started the process. And then it was pointed out to me that these big corporations give these groups a lot of money in the community, and they're very dependent.
Yeah, this is absolutely, it's the telecom company's fault. I mean, they're actively trying to exploit folks, and they're incredibly good at what they do. They have lobbyists that are out there, pushing AstroTurf groups and roping groups into all kinds of different things. But I think in the end, it's really important to follow the leadership of the groups that are on the ground organizing in communities of color around this, again, like the Center for Media Justice and others, who are doing the real work and, opposing this, false narrative that's pushed by telecom lobbyists. But again, we really need folks to get out to these hearings. So it's the 15th, 16th, and 17th in Fresno, Los Angeles, and San Diego. So if you know anyone in any of those cities, or if you're in one of them, definitely get out there, and you can find all the information about the events on the website that, thanks for putting it up there, Lauren. This merger will make your cell phone bill more expensive.com.
Okay, great. It was really great talking with you, Evan. You do such wonderful work, and I hope you'll come back on again if we have any more news that we have to report on any of these subjects.
Sure. Well, there's never a shortage of battles around the internet. But thanks so much for having me on, Lauren, and thanks for all that you do.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to do my little new segment of the show, which is the news segment, in which I feature a national and a local issue. First, I want to start off with talking about the shutdown. This is saying that Trump stormed out of a meeting that he had today with Pelosi and Schumer. He lasted about 30 minutes, and Schumer said that he said, "Why don't you open the government and stop hurting people?" And then Trump said, "Because then you won't give me what I want." Trump made clear to the Democrats there will be no deal without a wall, said Mike Pence, and it was the third meeting in a week, all of which were unproductive. He also was defiant in a lunchtime meeting with Senate Republicans. We have blowback with the usual suspects, Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, urging Trump to reopen the government agencies. And of course, they will be useless. But also Mitt Romney and Lindsey Graham made some noises about trying to fix the situation. But they say that McConnell is not going to budge because he's running for re-election and he has to stand strong. The House did take up a bill to fund the IRS, which is the first of a series of piecemeal measures to open up portions of the government. But only 8 GOP lawmakers joined the Democrats in voting for that. So as usual, we have a dysfunctional government here in Washington, D.C. But we're actually doing a lot better here in Los Angeles.
We can finally claim that there's a victory today because two proposed motions, one on the Mira Loma women's jail that would be located in Lancaster, and a motion related to the men's mental health jail. Those motions have been continued for the next couple weeks. Supervisor Sheila Kuehl from the 3rd District and Supervisor Solis from the 1st District have come out in opposition of these jails. And we can finally claim this victory after 7 years. Yes. Yes. And we're here to urge the board that if they really want to pour concrete, that if they want to build something, that it not be another cells.
The Sheriff's Department and the county spent over $750 million over a 7-year period incarcerating women for largely nonviolent crimes and drug offenses. What this means is that we are criminalizing women with mental health needs and substance abuse issues instead of reinvesting that money into their care and support. We also found that women lost a collective amount of 16,000 years over this 7-year period in jail. That's time away from their families, their homes, and their jobs. Imagine what we can do if instead we reinvest this money into the communities and into the support that they need.
We need to humanize our people and provide the very much needed resources rather than continue to criminalize us and continue to put us in cages. We are demanding that the Board of Supervisors do the right thing, that stand up with our community rather than with investors that are filling up their pockets.
Through diversion, decriminalization, bail reform, and investment in community-based resources, LA County can lower its jail population size. No more building houses of trauma and torture, but building places where families can see their loved ones, places where children can live and thrive.
We're asking you to build communities and build people and divert our resources towards places that can build our communities, sources of compassion, sources that helps people to grow, and not areas where we continue to build structures of capitalism that continues to line people's pockets, but at the same time destroy our communities.
We need all the women on this board to take a stand around incarcerating women, because you are impacting the children of those women as well. As someone that grew up with an incarcerated parent, I know the impacts on children. My family was homeless as a result. We were undocumented with little to no services. But if we are investing billions in our most marginalized communities, we can make a different Los Angeles for our next generation.
They had a huge victory, and the LA County Board of Supervisors did decide to rethink the entire $3.5 billion jail plan. The entire board unanimously supported a halt to the jail plan and expressed a desire to invest in community-based alternatives. Supervisor Kuehl attributed the board's shifting position to the persistent advocacy of community. And I actually watched the live stream, and she said she saw the film about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She saw the movie twice and the documentary 4 times. So obviously she's an RBG fan. She said, "I'm just really struck by how advocacy changes the times and the minds of the people, and those who are in the position to change the law rely on it, depend on it, and can act on it." And also, Hilda Solis said, "I don't think mental health services should be provided, as you said, in a cage, but we should try to provide the best assistance outside with leadership and with our departments and our new mental health director engaged more directly." What they want you to do now is call or email to thank the supervisors and urge their continued opposition. Apparently, this matter is being continued for 3 weeks. Hit them up on Twitter, and also make sure that Sheriff Alex Villanueva makes good on his promises, because he also came out during the campaign, his campaign for sheriff, as being opposed to this jail plan.
The Los Angeles Department of Water and Power has proposed that 3 obsolete gas plants be restarted at tremendous cost to ratepayers. Billions of dollars would be spent making these plants ready to spew carbon into our air again. Enough. Leave the gas in the ground. Leave the gas plants broken. Spend these billions instead on investing in the green economy of the future. That is our demand.
Garcetti, we're ready for clean power now! Garcetti, we're ready for clean power now! And we are here today to tell Mayor Garcetti to stop investing in fossil fuels, stop building gas plants, and move to 100% renewable energy. So we all know that we have 12 years or less to get off fossil fuels and solve the climate crisis, and we have to do that in Los Angeles today. We can make these decisions this year. 2019 is going to be the year that our city decides to invest billions of dollars, upwards of $6 billion, in more gas plants, or we could spend that money for the clean energy revolution we so desperately need in our city.
It seems like our elected leaders don't really seem to get what climate change is all about. They say they believe in science, they like to say they believe in climate change, but they don't have a plan for this 12-year timeline. And we have to completely change our economy in order to really do what the science says we need to do, in order to safeguard our children and safeguard our future. You know, the city of Los Angeles has 3,000 active oil wells and gas wells in the city limits, and one of those gas wells catastrophically blew out and terrorized my community in a massive gas blowout. That gas well was storing gas that would be used in these power plants that this utility is talking about spending billions of dollars to repower.
How much more gas?
Not one more plant!
How much more gas?
Not one more plant!
Our city has really strong renewable goals. We have really engaged climate activists. Many of us in this state do not believe that we should be fracking any longer, and we cannot be building the infrastructure that keeps us dependent on these sources of fuel for the next decades to come.
In 1941, when the American fleet was bombed in Pearl Harbor, our country knew the enemy had arrived at our doorstep. We could not continue business as usual. We mobilized, we fought back, and we won. The enemy today is in every state, in every city in this country. It is in every nation in the world bent on destruction, and that's climate change. LADWP must not invest in repowering 3 local gas plants. PG&E is replacing their 3 gas plants with energy storage. LADWP must not invest in repowering the Intermountain Power Project coal plant as a gas plant with a 50-year contract. Southern California Edison is investing in batteries and solar, not gas. Wind, solar, and battery prices are plummeting, and it is unconscionable for this city to invest in long-term gas.
Garcetti, we're ready for clean power now!
Saturday, I'm going to be covering the Organizing for Bernie / progressive 8M parties. Monday, I'm going to be out with the teachers who are going on strike. I'm going to be at one of the school sites covering that strike. This is the first year the teachers have struck, I believe, in Los Angeles since 1989, and this is the second largest school district in the country. You know, they've been without a contract for 2 years. They've been meeting like very frequently with Austin Butner, who is the new millionaire head of the school, LAUSD, the school district superintendent, and they have not been able to come to terms. Basically, he's met them as far as their salaries go, their salary increase, but they are looking for smaller class sizes, and they want to have counselors, nurses in every school. That is my show for tonight, and until you see me again, keep fighting.